Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Global Women in Security Alliance 2020, our virtual series. My next guest, Holly Brierley. She's the account director at Anvil Group. Miss Holly, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Today, we're going to talk about security and executive protection during COVID. Now, this has got to be one of the most perplexing challenges in the security industry because, of course, with executive protection, you're in close protection, close proximity. This has got to be difficult. But first, tell me a little bit more about what you do in your current role and how you ended up there.
Yeah, sure. I just want to say thank you for inviting me to take part in this initiative. I really appreciate the invite and involving me. So currently, I'm an account director at the Anvil Group. My focus is on our clients and their sort of travel risk management and business resilience program. From day to day, I'm responsible for the management of our clients across a variety of industries in banking, insurance, pharmaceutical, medical, and so on and so forth. But prior to my role here, I actually worked as an executive protection or EP operative, and I worked for a SIA 500 company, a private security company in London, as an ops manager. And I kind of gained my on-the-ground experience working as an EP operator, sort of combined with my experience in my role in London. And I studied a diploma to try and further my education. And all of this has kind of stood me in good stead for my current role because it's helped me have a better understanding of risk and the process of assessing risk and how risk actually impacts our clients directly now.
So tell me a little more about executive protection. Let's define it for our listeners because, in my experience, executive protection in Europe, a little different than executive protection here. And close protection is the key word here, especially in COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the US, it's typically referred to as executive protection, but here in Europe, we tend to call it close protection, or particularly in the UK. Executive protection, EP, close protection, CP, you'll probably hear it called. But really, we're looking here at the security and risk mitigation measures that we take to ensure the safety of some very important people or individuals that we'll call your principal. And these people may be exposed to increased personal risk, maybe because of what they're employed to do or their status or just their wealth or any affiliations they have. And kind of depending on who your principal is, your role can be quite varied. It's a really dynamic, fast-paced, really all-consuming job role where really your fundamental job is to protect your principal or principals from actual and perceived threats. It's a really exciting job role. There's global travel, luxury hotels, sometimes yachts and private jets, and you might come across some really interesting people. It's really exciting. It's very, very demanding, but really no 2 days are the same. And kind of depending on who your principal is or the destinations where you're heading to or the location of where your principal's residence is, where you may be actually protecting them. An EP operator has to consider the events that have the potential to impact the safety and well-being of not only your principal physically, but also their reputation. They've hired you for a reason, and your job is to understand what that is and the real and the perceived risks to them. This could be anything from if you're working with a celebrity and they have someone that's really excited to see them on the red carpet and they get a little bit overexcited, or this could be if you're working with a principal in a more austere environment where there's potential for kidnapping or a really complex security situation, or even what we kind of alluded to earlier, the risk of infection from COVID-19. But really, it's just really diverse. It's really demanding. You can find yourself being employed for a ton of different roles and purposes. But one thing that's for sure is you need to be kind of dynamic. You need to be able to quickly assess risk, have good general knowledge, and really be well trained and experienced in what you're doing.
So one of the hats I wore at the studios involved executive protection. And I always found, a lot of times when you outsource this, a lot of the firms are into the brute force side of it. We're going to surround it with a bunch of guys with suits and earpieces and sunglasses and
Right.
guns, and that's going to protect them. I never bought into that. I always thought that the intelligence gathering beforehand was the most important consideration. Tell us what
Right.
some typical considerations are before we actually deploy the EP task force. Really, there's a lot of groundwork going on
Mm.
before that first day of come with me, sir.
Yeah, so actually, this was one of my favorite things to do pre-deployment, was actually finding out who your principal is and profiling who they are. So hopefully you have some time before you actually deploy on task to really understand as much as you can, obviously, who your principal is, because that will help give you kind of a better understanding of any potential risks. So, I mean, just how high profile are they? Are they a household name or an A-list celebrity? Are they actually quite high profile in their local community? Whereas, they may walk into a room now and we wouldn't know who they are, are they high profile where they live? What are their business interests? Are they involved in something more hostile, such as takeovers, oil and gas, or politics? These are all things that we need to consider. Are they outspoken politically? Do they voice their opinions on controversial matters? Do they tend to be a quiet philanthropic type? All the things that we need to consider to understand who your principal is and how that actually elevates potential risk. One really important thing that always needs to be taken into consideration is your principal's health and well-being, particularly now, obviously, with the world that we're living in. If you have the opportunity, would always consult with ideally a medical professional within their circle or their family office to try and understand what their kind of physical makeup is. Do they have any pre-existing medical conditions, any allergies, and if yes, what are those? And will they put your principal into some kind of high risk category, especially to increase the likelihood of becoming infected with COVID-19 and potentially having some more adverse side effects? And also, what is your principal's current risk appetite to COVID-19? Some people were finding extremely precautious. However, others may just want to kind of go about their business like nothing has happened. We also need to consider where you're traveling to and what the risks of traveling to that location are. If you're lucky enough to have been given an itinerary ahead of your task and know exactly where you're going and what the kind of schedule is, can you do some research to identify potential risks ahead of time to better prepare yourself? Are there any events that are taking place, any scheduled events taking place at your destination? How that's going to impact your freedom of movement and your safety? Is there any civil unrest? Are there any demonstrations or protests planned? There's a lot of that going on in the world at the moment, and quite short lead protests and demonstrations. So that's always something to be considerate of. And looking at in-country support, so embassy and local police resources. Also considering, where are the local hospitals and medical facilities? So, I mean, if there are any at all, you'll find in some more remote environments that you don't have access to medical facilities. And if you are traveling to a location that may be a little bit more remote, do you feel that you are suitably qualified, or do you feel comfortable enough to actually administer first aid or provide basic life support to your principal if you really need to? And if you are going to somewhere that has hospitals or medical facilities, check out where they are. So look at points of interest and see how far from your hotel or your principal's place of work or any particular known locations. See how far away they are from hospitals or medical facilities, just to try and get a feel for the location that you're going to. I always try always tried to sort of read as much in my downtime. So there are risks of going to certain destinations, and we need to look at and understand what that means for you and your principal. I'd always conduct sort of a threat and vulnerability risk assessment. So look at the actual potential threats versus any security measures that are going to be in place. So like, will it just be yourself on task, or are you going to have a full team around you supporting you? And can you identify any weaknesses or vulnerabilities in those security measures? And how can you just think ahead of time of how you can mitigate some of those risks if you were to come up against them? There are a ton of other things to think about sort of pre-deployment. Have you got the right visas, permits, vaccinations? Have you got the right clothing for your trip? There's a ton of times, well, there's been times before where you could end up at a black tie event where you weren't expecting to. So don't ever be afraid to ask, are there planned events like this where you might need to have smart evening wear? And it sounds really simple, but it can be quite embarrassing not having the right clothing for the task at hand. So, things like having a grab bag for deployment, so first aid kit, make sure you have like a pen, a notepad, extra chargers for your phones. And now particularly, obviously, we're going to have to carry more hand sanitizers, face masks, or any appropriate PPE that you might need. So really, there are a ton of things to think about before task.
There are a ton of things to think about. And
there's so many more as well.
It's mind-boggling, really. So let's focus on this. The forward placement of the assets is the key to success here, right? We want to be ahead of any potential threat we can think of. But let's say I'm out in the field, I'm doing close protection. What should I have at the forefront of my mind? I'm the operator on the ground, I'm there. What's my number one consideration? Maybe it's a mind process, maybe it's how I think. What is the key to keeping ahead of things when on deployment?
Right. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, Chuck. It's all about trying to be a few steps ahead of your principal. So this is a skill that you will acquire over time, but without being intrusive, because you obviously have to be considerate of people's personal space and things. But I would always try and monitor my principal's behavior. If you tend to work with someone for a duration of time, you'll pick up on body language and how they communicate. Try and pick up on locations or future plans that they may mention, so you can quickly have a Google on your phone and do some research if you have a minute's downtime. Principals will they will inadvertently communicate with you without directly communicating to you and telling you what they want to do and where they want to go. Each principal is different. Some will be quite direct and say, I want to go here at this time, and then I'm going to go hereafter and hereafter. Whereas some, they will just keep you on your toes, and they will either change their plans last minute, or they will just tell you last minute and expect you to adapt to it. So that's definitely something we always need to be considering, what is coming next and anticipating the next move. So, where are you going next? Is the location known to you, and your principal? What's the kind of mode of transport? Not every principal likes to jump in their chauffeured car. They can catch you off the cuff sometimes and just say, well, I want to hop on the train or the underground to get to this location because it's quicker and easier. So just be considerate. Think of, always think ahead, because that can change at the drop of a hat. And if you're actually going to a particular location, you should be thinking ahead. So is it going to be safe for the principal to get out of the car when you arrive there? Be their eyes and ears. Do they know where to go? I've worked with some people before where they've arrived somewhere where they've not been to before, and they're expecting you to know where to go, or to at least guide them. So you need to be really observant. When you're on location, identify safe routes and how to get out of the building in case of an emergency. And again, thinking how long you're going to be there, what's your next move, and where are you going to next? And this all kind of comes back around to being a few steps ahead of your principal. So, and always continually assessing the environment around you. So really, this hugely depends on where you are and what you are doing, but you need to be really alert and observant to any emerging changes in the environment. So you can typically you can feel if something's changing within the environment. You have that gut feeling, or you can just have a different sense. You know, what may be a really small controlled protest or something near a restaurant where you're dining, you know, that may have the potential to escalate quickly and become a threat that actually could impact yours and your principal's safety. One thing that always on deployment, I do consider my own personal safety. It is common to be so focused on your principal, because that's your job role, that you forget about your own safety. So just also be aware to any risk that you may be exposing yourself to. You know, the EP operator may be expected to be the grey person, obviously depending on what you're employed to do. But you need to be in close enough proximity to your principal to be able to intervene and direct them out of harm's way if, you know, an incident were start to develop that could potentially impact them. And if you and your principal are caught up in an incident, it's too late and your sort of lines of defence have failed. But then you need to sort of be working quickly and risk assessing of how you can actually get out of that incident that you're caught up in.
Holly, that was an excellent summary. And there's one thing you said that I've never heard say about executive protection, and I will say I think it's the most important thing. You need to pay attention to the behavior of your principal. And I think from my experience, you almost need to pay attention to that more than anything else, because that's a constant flow and ebb and change. And if the principal changes their behavior, it changes your plan. So very, very good insight. Now, let's talk about COVID-19 and how that's going to impact an operator's day job. I thought about this when it came out. Here are my thoughts. I hear feedback from EP people. Well, you know, COVID-19, we got to put masks on. We have social distance. I said, wait a minute. You were going to take a bullet for this guy before COVID-19 came out. Now you're worried about catching COVID, which, you know, might make you sick and might do something to you. Has this really changed people's, you know, mindsets on executive protection? Because literally, if you're in this business, you are willing, ready, and able to put your life at risk to protect your principal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said before, that's the role that we're employed to do, to protect your principal. I think things will certainly change a little bit. Executive protection will absolutely continue. I do feel that the number of people that require protection is continuing to increase. But it's strange when we're supposed to be conducting close protection or close personal protection, that we are being constantly kind of reinforced to hand, space, and space and create distance between us and other people. So really, I think going forward, it's going to require some thought, some consideration, some planning, but I think EP operators in the industry will need to adapt. There are tons of things that need to be considered now or taken into consideration as part of an EP operator's day job. You know, first and foremost is yours and your principal's potential exposure to COVID-19. You know, we've seen a huge impact on travel, so inability to travel in and out of certain countries, and how your nationality and the passport that you actually hold may impact your ability to travel as freely, and will also potentially impact quarantine restrictions. We've already started to see an increase for requests in COVID-19 testing before deploying on task, regular COVID-19 testing whilst on task, obviously increased PPE or personal protection measures to try and limit exposure for you both. Also, you know, we need to consider, are you looking after yourself and taking every precaution because your role is to keep your principal safe. Are you doing everything you can to mitigate your risk against potentially catching COVID-19 to ensure that there is no possibility of transmitting that to your principal were you to deploy on task? So, you know, as I just said, we have seen an increase in a requirement for testing prior to deployment, and it's really important to know the difference between the tests that are available and what that means for you. So when we talk about antibody testing, you know, that determines if there are antibodies in your blood. And if that test is positive, it means that you have had COVID-19 at some point, not necessarily that you have it right now, but it means that you have some immunity, although that is yet to be confirmed. Whereas COVID testing or PCR testing actually involves taking a swab inside your nose and the back of your throat, and that will tell you whether or not you are currently infected with COVID-19. And this, linking back into the travel here, you may actually be required to take a PCR test for travel purposes. So if you're deploying on a task, check absolutely before you travel anywhere with the airline or your travel booker, because most destinations are now stipulating that you need to have a test a certain number of hours prior to your flight to ensure you check whether or not you have COVID-19 before you're actually allowed to travel. So do touch base with your agent or your airline to see if there's any stipulations there. Another consideration regarding COVID-19 is you may actually have to spend quite a length of time with your principal, which means you have very limited interaction with friends, family, and the outdoors. You know, you may be required to self-isolate 2 to 3 weeks before your deployment, depending on your principal's risk appetite for COVID-19. So actually consider before you accept a task or a deployment, is it right for you? There was a discussion or major topic of discussion throughout the pandemic is your mental health and well-being. So are you happy to be away from and not able to communicate regularly with your family and friends? So before you accept a task, take this into consideration, because it can impact different personality types. And unless you have sort of extenuating circumstances, if you try and leave a deployment halfway through, it could potentially be quite damaging for you professionally. And if you do end up in the unfortunate situation where you and your principal or other people in your party have COVID-19 symptoms, you may actually be required to self-isolate. So understand before you deploy, or if you're already on deployment, as quickly as possible, what that may look like. So have you considered where you and anyone else and your principal can safely self-isolate? You won't be able to travel via commercial means if you test positive, so you could end up being stuck in one location for 2 weeks. You may still be expected to carry out your job role and support your principal in other ways, kind of become their right-hand man and conduct other tasks for them. But consider where you can get food supplies from, food and water, basic things. Have you got access to sufficient medical facilities or medical support in case you are likely to need it? And consider actually if things start to deteriorate, or you or your principal's health starts to deteriorate, where is the nearest intensive care facility and where can you get support from? So there are a lot of things to actually consider before deployment and on deployment, now that we're in a COVID-19 world.
Well, this brings me to my next topic of discussion, which I think is right on point to what you just said. Executive protection is a specialty vertical, a subgroup of security. And people really look at it as a specialty, but really aren't most EP operators expected to be experts on most things, making them a generalist, right? But a generalist in the sense that they know a little bit about all the vertical markets in security. And you just need to know almost a little about everything to do this job right. What do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes me think of so many funny situations I've been in tasks over the years. But yes, absolutely. You may be expected to have a crystal ball and be able to look into the future or answer the most obscure questions, but I like to call it being an educated practitioner, knowing a little bit about everything. You try and stay well read, stay up to date with current affairs, um, have a knowledge of what's going on in the world, key topics that are going on internationally, and obviously at the moment COVID-19 is on the tip of everyone's tongue. So as an operator, you will absolutely be expected to know what is going on if you haven't already become a professional on it overnight. At basic level, you should know the signs and symptoms of COVID-19 so you can identify that within yourself or your principal or anyone in the party. So, we all know a loss or change to your sense of smell or taste. This means you've noticed that you cannot smell or taste anything, or things smell or taste different to normal. An increased temperature, so if you feel hot to touch on your chest or your back, or a new continuous cough. If you're coughing a lot more than an hour, or 3 or more coughing episodes in 24 hours, I think is stipulated. So really know what to look for, just to make sure you can identify that within yourself or your principal. Have an idea of what is going on with COVID-19 globally, so you can actually discuss that at an appropriate level with your principal. So be aware of any locations that are trending upward, understand the risk or exposure if you're actually operating near your principal's residence or anywhere that they're considering traveling to. Have a look at the trends over the last few months, know the hotspots, were there any high profile cases, and always look to the government for guidance and advice, whether that's provided by your principal's home embassy or a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You really need to know, especially if you're moving around quite a lot with your principal, the restrictions, limitations, quarantine measures, and all of the above. Really, you just need to be able to understand. It all comes back down to assessing the risk and understanding what the risk is to your principal.
So, in closing, let's talk about some additional COVID-19 risk measures that EP operators should be anticipating.
Yeah, so I mean, as EP operators, you care about your client, you care about your profession, and basically you need to evolve quickly before you get replaced by another solution, because your principal is not going to wait for you to catch up. And obviously we know that we need to take this COVID-19 pandemic seriously. It has had huge health and economic consequences for millions of people around the world. And I think it is going to change the game a little bit in the private security industry. And to help you continue being an educated practitioner, you need to consider what you need to be doing to mitigate risk as much as possible. So understanding where the highest possible risk of catching COVID-19 or potentially catching COVID-19 is, in densely populated areas, major cities where there's poor hygiene standards, public transport, major travel hubs, or countries and cities where they haven't been particularly strict enough with social distancing or protective equipment standards. Typical day-to-day things for EP operators, the vehicles that you're using, how can we really know that they have been properly sanitized? You need to do some research and understand the different kinds of quality assurance procedures that should be used, and if that company or that contractor that you're working with for vehicles are implementing the things that they should be implementing. And same for the drivers of the vehicles and any other EP operators. Are they infected, contagious? Are they healthy? Are they safe? Again, if an entirely controlled procedure has not been set out for the task, is there really a way of us knowing? but we need to make sure that mitigation measures are put in place. So the use of PPE. But again, we look at the types of PPE that drivers will use and other operators will use, and are they sufficient? And do they understand the correct way to implement PPE measures? Other daily things to consider: hotel rooms, meeting rooms, restaurants, have they been sanitized and are they safe for your principal to be in? And similar to the vehicles, understand what type of measures these restaurants and hotels should be taking and whether or not they are actually implementing those measures. You know, none of the above are controlled environments, and it's highly unlikely that they can be controlled entirely. So one thing to consider is visiting these places actually necessary? You know, can your principal conduct their business remotely? Because as an operator, we simply can't control the disinfection of every meeting room, or we can't control the people our principal chooses to meet necessarily, and how any other contagion measures are used. You know, it all comes back down to continually assessing the landscape and where you are. There's the physical environment that you're currently in and the kind of wider landscape. Be aware of what's going on in the media, understand the no-go areas, understand the potential threats, so you feel educated and you can provide informed and researched advice, either when you are briefing your principal or if you are actually advising them against going somewhere or doing something. You know, COVID-19, it poses a threat to all of us. There's not a single person that the virus has not affected in one way or another. However, as an operator, you need to be able to really form an educated, informed decision on the potential risk to your principal. It would be really easy to say, no, this is too risky, you need to stay locked down in your homes. However, you know, an EP operator's job is to enable their principal to go about their business in a safe and protected way. However, all of this in mind, people are still traveling and moving around the world, and they need to be supported to do so safely. So I think EP will absolutely continue, but we just need to start to adapt and consider other measures as well.
Ms. Holly, I've done close to 2,000 interviews of security practitioners around the world, and I'm going to say this is the best, most comprehensive summary of executive protection I have ever heard. And to use a term over the pond, brilliant. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant.
You are too kind.
Thank you so much for coming on the Global Women in Security Alliance 2020 virtual series, and good luck to you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.